Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Keyrock. We're digital asset market makers based in Europe. Actually, today what I'm going to speak about is whether we are building a fair market. And to do that, I will start by sharing some insight about what the market actually looked like when we started the company 5 years ago. Was it a fair market back then? I will then look at the progress that we've made over the last 5 years. We will discuss how DeFi actually impacts the whole thing, and then finally I will share a few thoughts about how I see things moving forward as it comes to building a fair market together. If you've been in crypto for a while, unfortunately, you might be very familiar with that type of chart. I wouldn't expect you guys to actually know this specific chart. I recognize the instrument that was traded here, but the type of chart is very telling, right? It's vintage crypto. That's a typical pump and dump. So you have some investors that have a preferred position, preferred means, preferred information that just pump the price of a security up until a certain point that they deem to be sufficient, and then just dump on all other market participants and basically pocket in their profits. This is blatant price manipulation on the market. Of course, that is quite at odds with the narrative that you will have in the conference today and yesterday, right? About how Web3 is working to build a more financially inclusive world. This is very far from it, clearly. This is a type of market behavior that we need to root out of the market. Unfortunately, they used to be quite prevalent, and to be fair, they still to some extent are. To show to what extent, actually, I think it's interesting to share this slide that is basically what used to be the first slide of our historical, commercial presentation as a market-making company, and it actually says a lot about the market expectations back in 2017. Basically, what this slide says, right, you can see just the screenshot here, is that as a market-making company, we do not trade against ourselves, we do not take price targets, and we do not partake in market manipulation. You would think that's quite basic, and I would tend to agree, but the reality is that we were asked those things so often in 2017 when we launched by multiple different market participants that we actually had to make a slide out of it to tell everybody from the get-go that these are things that we do not take part in. That would act as a filter for the counterparties that we were trading on. So very clearly, the expectations back then were quite different. And when I say back then, I'll share a bit of context about Keyrock. So I created the company in 2017, and we've been active for more than 5 years now as a digital assets market maker. Today, we actually make market on venues for more than 100 partners, be it issuers or exchanges themselves. We have integrated more than 85 venues everywhere in the world, and on those, we trade more than 400 individual instruments, and therefore many more markets. The reason I'm sharing this is just to illustrate that we are an integral part of the market infrastructure as a market maker, right? As such, we've seen where the market was in terms of being fair or not. We've seen how it evolves, and be happy to share some insight about where I think it's going nowadays. So how do we work towards a fair market? Basically, we need two things. We need transparency, and we need accountability. With transparency, basically, it's about being able to identify and detect as early and as openly as possible the problematic behaviors that you're going to see on the market, such as the pump and dump that I was showing earlier. We then need accountability. It's nice to identify problematic behaviors, but then, of course, you need to be able to pinpoint the perpetrators of those behaviors and make sure they are being held accountable. You need both transparency and accountability to go towards a fair market. So how much have we progressed since the days of that pump and dumps, in the days of that first slide, in actually building fair markets on centralized digital markets? When it comes to transparency first, we see that very clearly our industry, and we see many of them here today, has attracted the wealth of talent from the traditional financial sector. This has tremendously increased the literacy around market making, what market makers can do and cannot do, and therefore definitely reduce the incentives to partake into problematic behaviors on the market. Moreover, when it comes to the data, we think that the data is a lot more available on the market now than it was back in 2017, right? Of course, you have many participants that just share data openly and freely on the market, but you also have whole companies such as the guys at Keyrock or Messari. Basically, their entire product is making sure that market data is available to be analyzed and to be looked through. So very clearly, progress has been made on the transparency front. When we look at accountability, we see a better oversight, market-wide, mainly for all the largest trading venues. That oversight is brought both externally with historical regulators, but also internally as an industry. And all in all, what we have now is a near ubiquitous KYC and AML processes in place on the market to make sure that at all time you are able to know who you are trading with and the history of the transactions, basically. Of course, as market makers, we have a very large responsibility to foster that transparency. And what I'm sharing here, is just a basic kind of a reporting that we provide our clients, that we provide our partners, both live and historically, to help them gain insight into their markets. What you see here are different levels of outstanding liquidity in a given order book, right? We're able to see the outstanding liquidity on the buy, the sell side, how it evolves at different price targets, how it evolves over time. But more importantly, what we are able is to use that information to actually create insight. Work with our partners, work with our clients to detect problematic behaviors, take it back to the venues, and make sure that we work towards eliminating them in the future, But that work that we do on transparency is only relevant if we are actually being held accountable as market participants, as market makers. For us, this means two things. One, of course, is upholding the current regulatory requirements, in all the relevant jurisdictions when it comes to KYC and AML compliance, and therefore have a full KYC AML compliance. But the second, of course, is going the extra mile and actually working towards, a complete broker-dealer license in all the leading jurisdictions. We think that KYC AML, which is, the current basic requirement, is good enough, right? It's a good start. You are able to know who you are trading with. But just knowing who you're trading with does not mean that you're held accountable as to how you trade on those markets. And this is why we believe it's important to go that extra mile, in acquiring more complete licenses as, key part of the market infrastructures. Now, if we take a bit of a step back, and we summarize what I've been saying for around 7 or 8 minutes now, what you might have understood is that, things were terrible back then. Things got a lot better now on centralized market, and most of it is thanks to market maker. Of course, that would be a complete lie, right? We need to be honest with ourselves, as an industry, and be able to look at the types of markets we're building and recognize all the work and the improvement that still has to be done. But at the same time, it's important to also be able to look at the progress being made so that we can learn from it and double down towards creating fairer markets on centralized markets. Now, how does DeFi come into this? Has DeFi helped? Is DeFi actually helping in making markets fairer? When you talk about decentralized finance, you're going to hear very different things. So on one end of the spectrum, some guys would tell you that we're going backwards. In decentralized finance, you don't have KYC, you don't have AML. Front running and other manipulations are very abundant on the market. And you have a massive expertise asymmetry between all the market participants with very little safeguarding, right? So these guys will tell you that DeFi is completely lawless. On the other hand, you will hear the exact opposite. They would tell you we are progressing tremendously thanks to decentralized finance. The rules are clear. You can read the smart contract. The actions are transparent. You can see all the transactions. And there are no more proprietary databases. So very clearly, thanks to DeFi, we finally have a true level playing field where we are all equal under the law of code. How do you take those two perspectives and actually reconcile them in that small transparency accountability framework? Is DeFi actually making either or better? When you look at transparency, clearly we have amazing data that is available for all for free without silos whatsoever. That sounds great, but the problem is that the absolute composability of DeFi, which is clearly one of its main advantages, the possibility to build one on top of the other, means that the data is incredibly complex to decipher. So you have loads of information, yes, but that does not mean you have more transparency on the market. When you look at accountability, you actually have two main changes. One is that we don't have intermediaries anymore. We cannot use those intermediaries as levers to hold the individual market participants accountable for their actions. You now need to directly regulate individual market participants. That, of course, comes with a lot of different questions that are beyond the scope of this talk today. But how do you do that? What technology do you use to actually regulate individual market participants? How do you do that in the scope of all the work being done towards on-chain anonymity? And who do you trust with such capabilities? The second change that we see on accountability is actually the emergence of a much more bottom-up approach towards market control and that of social and peer accountability, which is definitely in and out of itself a very net positive. But then how do we conclude now? If we look at where we were 5 years ago, how we progressed on centralized markets, what DeFi has and has not brought, where do we stand now, and how can we look forward towards building fairer markets? I think that we can say that there are great promises, but there are also very clear challenges, right? And as we progress and we evolve from centralized to more decentralization markets, I personally believe that not everything will be decentralized in the futures. I think that's a fallacy. I do not believe that every single market will be a decentralized one in 5 or 10 years. I think that we are going towards a mix, right? In the previous world, everything was centralized, you did not have a chance. In the future world, I think you're going to have a balance of both paradigms, where each brings its advantages to different part of the value chain, right? But if we go for something that was fully centralized to something that's going to be a mix of both, very clearly you can see that momentum of growth in decentralized finance. And when it comes to building fair markets, one could believe that it's going to be more and more decentralized. It means that the data is going to be more and more open, so eventually markets will get fair simply because of decentralization, so we can just sit back and relax. I think that would be a tremendous mistake. We must keep on building as an industry if we want decentralization to actually deliver on its promises and bring the next billion users. I mean, if you look at transparency, right, DeFi has been going very aggressive cycles of innovation for the last 4 or 5 years. What that creates is a mess. It's a very positive mess. It's a very productive mess. It's a very innovative mess, but it's still a mess. That means that you have an abundance of information, but that information is so abundant and so complex that you actually have no insight whatsoever. As market participants, we need to keep on building to go from pure information to actual insights, which will in turn give us transparency on the market behaviors. If you look on accountability now, I mean, the decentralized world that is ahead of us is very different from the centralized world that historical regulators were built and created to oversee and to structure. This is a world that comes with different understandings, that requires different tools. And we, as the company building these new worlds, we are the best positioned to actually help historical regulators get that understanding, get those tools, and ensure proper accountability on the markets. As I mentioned just before, we are seeing on this market in terms of accountability, a growth of bottom-up control. And I think that the insider trading scandal that we saw on OpenSea last year is a very good example of that. That scandal was not brought forward by the centralized historical regulator. That scandal was brought forward by users that detected problematic transactions on-chain, decided to call it out on Twitter, and then only did regulators step in. This is a perfect example of bottom-up oversight, right? But this kind of trend, which is in and out of itself very positive and very powerful, has to be encouraged, has to be supported, has to be structured if we want to make it more than a simple hayfire. As market makers, we at Keyrock, we act as bridges, right? We are bridging centralized and decentralized markets. We are bridging institutionals and retail participants. And of course, as anybody in this room, I think that we want to be onboarding the next billion users to our digital assets markets. Of course, to do this, we need better tooling. We need better interfaces. We need less complexity. But I think that above all, what we need is to actually improve the value propositions of the markets we are building. We want to go from those absolute minefields where you're just about to be scammed and about to be manipulated to actual fair places of exchanges. And market makers, as key part of the market infrastructure, have an obligation to be positive catalysts in this evolution. And this is something that we at Keyrock are very committed to do. Thank you very much for your attention.